All right, joining me now to discuss about this whole contradiction between how the Western media, Western academic institutions, and also some government-sponsored committees in the West view India, particularly when it comes to minority rights and religious freedoms, and the actuality on the ground. Joining me now is Professor Salvatore Babones. He's a professor with the University of Sydney, joining us from Australia. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us. You've seen these various reports from the U.S. committees on religious freedom. You've seen the reports from the Pew Research Center. How do you explain this contradiction between the perception that there seems to be in the Western elite, whether it's in governments, academic institutions, even the Western media, about India's record under Narendra Modi's prime ministership on its treatment of minorities, on religious freedoms, etc. And when you have traveled here in India on a number of occasions in the last year or so, your impressions for how free people in India were to practice, profess, and propagate their religion?
The perception in the West, and certainly the perception in the United States, is that India has serious human rights problems that derive from the ill treatment of its Muslim minority population. And that perception is so strongly held that when a Wall Street Journal reporter was given the chance to ask one question of Mr. Modi at the White House, the question she chose to ask was, what are you going to do about the oppression of Muslims in India? Now, I don't have any impressions that would contradict that. All of my impressions come from the data. I don't want to talk, what is my impression? What did I feel when I visited India? I want to talk about the hard data we have about the status of Muslims in India. And the hard data completely contradict that general impression that comes to us through the U.S. media.
So what explains that? What explains that contradiction, not just in what we see in U.S. government institutions or media or academic institutions versus the reality on the ground?
Look, first, let's go through the data. I mean, we know from one of the best surveys that's ever been conducted, not only in India, but in the entire world, by the Pew Research Center, America's most respected survey research organization. We know that 98% of India's Muslims say they're free to practice their religion in India. 99% say they're free, that they're proud to be Indian. When they list the top 4 problems facing Muslims in India, they say number 1 is employment, number 2 is crime, number 3 is corruption, and they're only offered 4, and the 4th on the list is intercommunal violence. When they're asked, do we face discrimination in India, 24% of Indian Muslims say that Muslims do face discrimination. But that compares to 22% of Hindus who say Hindus face discrimination. Or put differently, that compares to 80% of African Americans, 46% of Hispanic Americans, and 42% of Asian Americans who say they face discrimination in the United States. We have large-scale Muslim in-migration to India. We have virtually no Muslim out-migration from India. In short, all of the data point to the fact that Indian Muslims are a well-adjusted, basically happy and certainly proud community within India. There's nothing there in the charges of an anti-Muslim human rights problem in India. It just doesn't exist.
Is it also because of the fact that, you take the recent examples where there have been ethnic clashes or communal violence flaring up, whether it is in the eastern state of Manipur or whether it is even in Haryana that happened a few weeks ago? Is it because the state has not acted quickly enough, or state players, ministers, prime minister have not come out and spoken quickly enough? Is that also a reason why this perception, which is wrong to begin with, as you say, has been further accentuated? No,
I think it's a clash between perceptions and reality. Our perceptions are driven by the news industry and by NGOs and activists who want to create, for whatever purpose. For the news industry, it's just to get clicks and sell newspapers, but for activists, it's to try to attract funding for an activist agenda. And these international activists are very keen to promote an idea that India is somehow repressing Muslims within the country. Now, we have data that say that's just not true. Now, how is it possible to peddle a narrative that's contrary to the data? Well, it's possible because we selectively look at cases. So, of course, there's been violence in Haryana. There's been violence in many places all over India ever since India has been a country. But that violence is at an extremely low level. I remind people India's GDP per capita, which is a good indicator of how peaceful a country will be. India's GDP per capita is only marginally higher than that of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, consider how much interethnic violence there is in sub-Saharan Africa. Or put differently, Latin America is about 4 times as rich as India on average. Look how much interethnic conflict there is in Latin America, which has half the population of India. So if you take a country of 1.4 billion people that's relatively poor, there will be incidents. What I want to do as a social scientist, I'm not a journalist, as a social scientist, I want to ask questions like, how common are those incidents? What's the rate of incidents per capita? How many people are being killed per capita? We want that to be 0, but how many people are being killed versus in other comparable countries? I mean, we had the case of a Muslim who was, horrifically, this is, earlier this year in Gujarat, who was tied to a post and lashed by police. Well, that's terrible. How can that happen? Well, in my own country, in the United States, we had the George Floyd incident, which resulted in the entire Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, an incident can happen. What we want to know is, when an incident happens, is it treated properly by the judicial system? Are those who perpetrated it brought to justice? Is the rate of incidents very low? And on all of those sorts of questions, India comes off looking very good.
So you also, in one of the papers that you put out recently, have drawn a comparison to Israel. That's the other country which strategically has been allied with the United States for a number of years, and yet there is a very, very substantial lobby in the media, in the academic institutions, even in the U.S. government that is out to get Israel, as you say. Do you see the same sort of handiwork at play when it comes to India? You've even coined the phrase that anti-Hinduism is the new anti-Semitism. Where did you come up with that comparison from? Explain that.
Anti-Hinduism is the new anti-Semitism, and just like the counterpart for anti-Semitism is respectable anti-Zionism, the counterpart to anti-Hinduism is respectable anti-Hindutva activism. So what we're seeing is many of the literally same organizations that have long been active in anti-Zionist causes, using those as a cover for an implicit anti-Semitism, those same organizations are now using the same tactics, but to attack Hindutva as a narrative, but under a broader rubric of being anti-Hindu. Now, that's not my own personal analysis. That's analysis coming actually from the organizations, the watchdog organizations that watch anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They've now been popping up reports of a parallel anti-Hinduism, anti-Hindutva. But, even as someone who doesn't study that personally, the tactics and the just the presentation with which we see anti-Hindu movements is just strikingly familiar to what we've seen for a long time from anti-Semitic movements.
And a final word, how does India then break out of this narrative? Is it linked to the current dispensation in power, and therefore people have their pre-held opinions about this dispensation? Or how does India sort of break out of this? Because again, you look at all the public events from U.S. government officials. You had Prime Minister Modi at the White House a few weeks ago, and he was literally, and India was literally the toast of town at that time. So how does India then break out of this narrative?
And 65 representatives walked out of the House of Representatives in protest at Mr. Modi's speech. Let's not forget. Look, India breaks out of this narrative by bringing the facts to the table. I had the honor to meet Mr. Modi here in Sydney when he visited Sydney. We had a 15-minute discussion, and all we talked about was data. Because the issue is India needs to get the data out. Now, I want to stress to everyone out there listening in India, this is not a BJP problem. This is an India problem. And in fact, under the previous Congress government, India was already rated one of the worst 5 countries in the world for freedom of religion by the U.S. International Religious Freedom Rankings. That pre-existed before Mr. Modi. Those rankings go all the way back to 2008, 2009, and India has remained in the bottom 5 in the world ever since 2008, 2009. Should a new government come to power in 2024, that new government will face all the same challenges and all the same problems. This is an India problem that India should unite around, not a partisan issue.
All right, Professor Salvatore Babones, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us on Brass Tacks.
Thank you.